10 teams, 20 seats, and a whole lot of drivers that would love a spot on the Formula One grid. So let's look at the 20 drivers that are currently taking part in this season and decide on whether they've done enough to stay or if they should pack up their helmet and go. You guys know how this goes. I'm going to work my way through the constructors, looking at the 20 drivers and decide if they should stay at their current team, move from their current team to another seat on the grid, or be gotten rid of from Formula One altogether. Let's start with the team that's already made a change this season, Alfa Towery. Nick de Vries would have definitely received my verdict that he should be on his way out of Formula One, but Red Bull went early and brought in Daniel Ricciardo to replace the Dutchman 2 races before the break. Which actually has made this a lot more difficult, because before I said that the team should probably replace Nick de Vries with Iwasa, mainly because I thought that Daniel Ricciardo wouldn't go to a team so far down the Formula One grid. They are last in the standings. However, now that Ricciardo is in an Alfa Tauri seat for the rest of the season, I think that changes my prediction. Let's start with the longest standing Alfa Tauri driver in Yuki Tsunoda. He had an exceptional start to the year, which started to fall away a little bit as the race weekends got wetter. The first 5 races saw him finish 10th or 11th, but after the rain in Monaco showed the shortcomings of that Alfa Tauri package, and any weekend where there's been any kind of rain, the Alfa Tauri hasn't quite had the pace it showed before, but going back to Yuki Tsunoda, I think he's already done enough to justify his spot for 2024. Whereas his brand new teammate Daniel Ricciardo is a little bit of a tricky one. Obviously, he's only been in the car for 2 weekends, but I think he's done pretty well from those weekends, bar an incident that wasn't his fault. For me, though, it's difficult to say whether Daniel Ricciardo should stay at Alfa Tauri. On the one hand, it's a Formula One seat, and they don't come around very often, but it's a seat at the worst team on the grid that's about to go through a massive change at the end of the season as the team gets a rebrand and possibly a new home. If I'm Daniel Ricciardo, someone that wants to be at the sharp end of the grid again, I think if he can, he should be looking to move away from the Alfa Tauri team. However, the seats towards the top are going to be very tricky to come by. Therefore, with all of that combined, I'm kind of leaning towards Daniel Ricciardo staying at Alfa Tauri, helping them through that turbulence of next season. And once he's established himself on the Formula One grid once again, there's probably going to be a seat for him further up the grid in 2025. Maybe even as a thanks for helping out with Alfa Tauri, Red Bull give him that second driver slot. One step up in the standings is Alfa Romeo, who will also have some turbulence behind the scenes to deal with at the end of the season. They'll become Sauber again, only to then become Audi in 2026, which has put both Bottas and Zhou in an awkward situation of not really knowing what the team wants from their driver pairing. Like, will Audi want a German driver in their lineup? Or will they want a world champion, like when Aston Martin brought in Sebastian Vettel? Nobody really knows. I predicted at the start of the season that Bottas would stay, and I think considering he has another year on his contract, I think he's still fairly safe. Although the Finn hasn't had an amazing season so far, you have to consider that the Alfa Romeo car isn't the most competitive on the grid right now, so he's probably done enough to keep his seat, and we have to remember that he also has the previous years of experience on his side. Like, he was part of that Mercedes team that won 8 Constructors' Championships. Which is where his teammate Zhou Guanyu falls down, in my opinion. Like, it's not his fault that he's only in his 2nd season of Formula One, but at the same time, he is in a team looking to move forward and trying to transition into a brand new era. So with that comes a lot of pressure to perform, and I don't think he's like underperformed necessarily, but he hasn't overperformed either. He's one of those drivers that you kind of forget is on the grid quite a lot of the time, which, as I've said before, isn't a terribly bad thing, but it's not a good thing. At the start of the season, I predicted that Zhou Guanyu would be replaced by Théo Pourchaire, and considering Théo is now at the top of the F2 standings with 3 races left to go, if he manages to win Formula 2 and gets that championship under his belt and then isn't able to take part in Formula 2 next year again, I think it's the right time for them to step him up into the main team. I think he'd be able to come in as a rookie and have a little bit less pressure on his back compared to Zhou Guanyu because of the fact that he would be a rookie, and because he knows that Audi is coming in a couple of seasons' time. There isn't loads of pressure to perform right now as the Sauber team, but also as a Sauber junior and also as their reserve driver this year, he has the additional backing of the Sauber part of the team and has worked with the team a lot in recent years. Haas have once again had an underwhelming season for me. On the Saturday, they seem right up there, and throughout the season, they've qualified really well, only for the cars come Sunday to slowly fall down the order, whether that be from incidents or strategy or often tyre degradation. situation. However, Nico Hülkenberg on his return to the Formula One grid has been incredibly impressive. He's managed to get that car into Q3 so many times ahead of Alpines, Astons, and even Red Bulls on occasion. And even though he was definitely the most boring choice for Haas coming into the 2023 season, he's shown he was definitely the right choice as well, and should definitely stick with the Haas team for the foreseeable future. His teammate Kevin Magnussen, though, hasn't quite been up to that level, and I think you could argue that he's probably had the worst season of any driver on the grid, or at least bottom 3, after last year with that surprise pole position in Brazil, and the amount of joy that brought the team. This is tough to say, but I think Haas should probably be looking towards getting rid of K-Mag. He actually cost the team a lot of points last year, constantly losing his front wing on opening laps, but he got away with it because he was comfortably better than Mick. Now that he has an experienced teammate next to him, it shows. As much as he's statistically the best Haas driver ever in their short history, and of course, we can't forget the pole position in Brazil last year, as I mentioned before, I think he might be running out of excuses. Now, I know that Haas are building their team around experienced drivers after a pretty tough couple of seasons with some rookies mixed into their team, but if Joe were to leave Alfa Romeo, he does have a couple of seasons of experience now, and he's maybe someone that they should look into. Like, he is very consistent. Also, he does bring in financial backing that Haas have been so desperate for in recent seasons, so I'm going to go with a little bit of a shock move of Zhou Guanyu moving over to Haas. Moving over to the newly resurgent Williams team, where James Vowles seems to really be pushing them in the right direction, we have two drivers that are at very different stages of their career and have had very different seasons so far. Logan is 12 races into his rookie season, and I think it shows. Like, he's struggled with that step from Formula 2 to Formula 1. He's at times shown the promise that Williams were looking for when they brought him into the team, but he hasn't shown it often enough. Now, we have to remember that we can only really compare him to Alex Albon, who is having an incredible season, and then the other driver we can compare him to is Nicholas Latifi, and he's definitely better than Nicholas Latifi. At the beginning of the season, I predicted that Williams would probably stick with Logan Sargeant, but actually, now after 12 races and 0 points, I'm thinking they might look in another direction, mainly because Alex Palou, who is currently leading the IndyCar Championship, has recently come out and basically just ripped up his contract with McLaren for the 2024 season. He was supposed to be joining McLaren's Arrows, which is their IndyCar team, but he's now said that he has no intention of fulfilling that contract. He does have a little bit of Formula 1 experience because he's had tests with McLaren and has now been linked with the Williams team. So if Williams are actually able to pick up an IndyCar champion, I think Logan Sargeant has to kind of step aside. So I'm going to go for a rogue shout here and say Williams replace Sargeant with Palou. Unless Alex Albon makes a move. The Thai driver has been on exceptional form this season and has been delivering time and time again in that Williams car, which has led to a few rumours of Alex maybe moving further up the grid. And if he can make that happen, I think he should definitely go for it. But I also feel like at Williams, he's got this perfect little place for him to grow. So I'm going to play it a little bit safe and say that Albon stays at Williams for the 2024 season. I might change my mind in 2025. Moving on to Alpine, who in 2023 have found themselves in a little bit of a no man's land because they're nowhere near the pace of the likes of McLaren or Aston Martin at the moment, but they're also miles better than the teams we've talked about so far in this video. At the beginning of the season, I said the combination of Gasly and Ocon would be a really good midfield driver pairing and would stick around at Alpine for the foreseeable future as long as the two of them got on. From the outside at least, it seems like they've been able to find a relationship with one another where they can work together off track, but they also seem to find each other quite a lot on track. However, I think the on-track problems have been slightly overshadowed this season, considering everyone behind the scenes at Alpine has decided to leave the team. So they now have the more pressing issue of replacing their backroom staff rather than worrying about their drivers. So even though Alpine were the main talking point last season when it came to the drivers market, we all remember the Fernando Alonso Oscar Piastri debacle, I can't see them making any moves for the 2024 season, and I'm sticking with my prediction that I made at the start of the year. McLaren is another interesting prospect. At the start of the season, when things really weren't going right, I predicted that Lando Norris might be looking elsewhere. I said that Lando Norris would make a really good partner for Max Verstappen at Red Bull if Sergio Perez didn't quite step up to the mark this season, and realistically, Sergio Perez hasn't really stepped up to the mark this season. However, I was not expecting the jump that we've seen in performance from the McLaren team. Since Austria, you could argue that Lando Norris has probably been in the top 3 or 4 drivers in terms of pace every single weekend, apart from Spa, where they got the setup wrong because they thought it was going to rain. Also, the driver I predicted might go into the McLaren setup to replace Lando Norris if he were to move on was Alex Palou, and with Zak Brown coming out and saying he's incredibly disappointed in Alex for not committing to McLaren's IndyCar team, he's probably not going to offer him a position in his Formula 1 team, even with all the investment in testing time and that free practice 1 session in COTA, where he was very impressive. So with McLaren looking so much better, I'm going to backtrack on my previous prediction, and I'm going to say that McLaren are able to hold on to Lando Norris by showing in the second half of the season that they're able to still move in the right direction, and with the updated wind tunnel and simulator that they have, they will eventually be able to deliver him a race-winning car. Also, at the beginning of the season, I was a little bit worried about Oscar Piastri and the amount of pressure that was going to be on him, but I backed him to show his quality, and he has most certainly delivered, to the extent I ranked him maybe a little bit too high in my mid-season driver rankings, which I'll leave below if you're interested. So he's not going anywhere for the 2024 season, and I hope will actually be alongside Lando Norris at McLaren for as long as possible. Stepping up to Ferrari, who again haven't had the best of seasons considering the hype that was around the car moving into this year, although again, I don't think you can really blame the drivers for that. The driver pairing of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz is still arguably the most rounded pair on the grid, with Leclerc being one of, if not the fastest qualifier out there, and Carlos Sainz being one of the most dependable and consistent drivers of the entire grid. So at the start of the season, I predicted that the two of them would probably stay put for 2024. Leclerc is supposedly being offered a contract which would keep him at the Ferrari team until 2029, which I think he'll probably take because he's clearly the number one at Ferrari, and I don't think it makes sense for him to move anywhere else, because even if he goes to a faster car like Red Bull, he would clearly be the second driver to Max Verstappen, and then there's also been talks of him joining Mercedes in place of Lewis Hamilton, but again, I think that's very unlikely for 2024. Sainz is maybe slightly more interesting in that his contract with Ferrari does end at the end of the 2024 season, so technically he only has one more year with the team unless he's offered an extension. The rumour around Sainz is though that he's been offered a pre-contract at Audi for the 2026 season, and that his old team boss Andreas Seidel wants to build the Audi project around the Spaniard. If that's the case, I think Sainz should definitely take up that option because he's never going to eclipse Charles Leclerc at Ferrari, but in terms of what we're talking about in this video and the 2024 season, I think Carlos should probably stay at the Scuderia for now. Moving on to Aston Martin, and again, I predicted them to do better this season, but my goodness me, I did not expect them to start the season as the second fastest car. Fernando Alonso picked up podium after podium at the beginning of the year and definitely justified his move from Alpine. There was, of course, the talk of his age and whether or not he was going to be retiring sometime soon, but let's face it, Fernando Alonso is just ageless at this point. He will continue to race in Formula 1 until he decides he's had enough. On the other side of the team, Lance Stroll just hasn't quite been up to the level of his teammate, which I think we all predicted, but what I didn't predict was the gap between them being this big, which has led to even more talk around him being replaced, especially if Aston Martin are serious about taking the next step and possibly fighting for championships. Lance, though, does have one ace up his sleeve in that his dad owns a big portion of the team, and has been a huge figurehead in the steps they've taken to getting to this point where they, well, at the start of the season, they were battling for podiums and possible wins, which they definitely wouldn't have predicted. So I predicted at the start of the year, Aston Martin's driver lineup would stay the same for the 2024 season, and unfortunately, I think it's still the case. However, next year, if they're able to continue this form and they're still right up there with the Red Bull and Mercedes cars, there may be some tricky conversations that need to take place in the Stroll household. I don't think we need to talk about Mercedes too much. For me, I flip-flop between them and Ferrari having the strongest driver lineup on the grid, although I kind of want to add McLaren to that now. But even so, the combination of Lewis Hamilton and George Russell seems perfect for where they are right now and also where they aspire to be. George is definitely having a bit of an up and down start to the season, especially considering how consistent he was last season. He doesn't look anywhere near as consistent this season, and since the upgrades have come from Monaco onwards, doesn't seem 100% settled in that car. But I think Mercedes will probably back him to adapt over the course of the second half of the season and definitely won't replace him anytime soon, especially considering how they put all that effort into his Williams seat and then brought him through and then have now settled him into the Mercedes setup. Then when it comes to Lewis and of course that contract negotiation that we've heard a little bit about every now and then in the media, I just can't imagine that him and Mercedes won't come to some form of agreement for the 2024 season, even if it's just a one-year extension, because Lewis Hamilton has still been one of the best drivers on the grid so far this year. Also, the rumour is that they want to give Lewis an ambassadorial role once he does retire from Formula One, so they'll definitely want to keep him within the Mercedes family, and therefore my prediction at the start of the season stays the same. I can't see Mercedes changing their driver lineup at all for the 2024 season. And finally, Red Bull, who, considering they're top of the constructor standings by a long way, have a lot of rumours going on around them, in particular the future of Sergio Perez's seat alongside Max Verstappen. Now, Max is contracted until after the 2028 season, and he's about to be a three-time world champion, so we don't really need to discuss him. However, Sergio is only contracted up until the end of the 2024 season, so does have a contract for next year, but for the moment, not any further. At the start of the season, I predicted that Sergio Perez might be replaced by Lando Norris because the McLaren driver would get frustrated with the fact that he isn't able to fight for wins and would want to move to a team that could offer him victories alongside one of his best friends on the grid, Max Verstappen. But as I mentioned before, I think that Lando will stay put at McLaren now, and I think that Daniel Ricciardo will probably be asked to stay at Alfa Tauri for the 2024 season to help steady that ship. Plus, Red Bull is so far ahead in the standings that they're under no pressure to make changes, and unless by the end of the season they're under real pressure from somebody else, Sergio Perez does a good enough job. So I'm backtracking once again on one of my earlier season predictions and going for the, well, slightly more boring option of Red Bull keeping the exact same driver lineup for the 2024 season as they currently have. Overall then, I think this year's driver market will be pretty quiet, with maybe only one or two drivers maximum making any kind of moves. But don't fret, because there's always calm before the storm, and maybe the 2025 driver lineups will be completely different. There are a lot of drivers out of contract, and that's when the chaos of silly season will really be back. Let me know if you agree with my thoughts on the 2024 driver lineups in the comments down below. And actually, if you enjoyed this video, I put together a video on some of the rumours surrounding the drivers at the moment, not just for 2024, but into the future, which I think you'll also really enjoy too. So click that link and I'll see you over there.